What happens to gods when empires collapse? Around 1200 BCE, the ancient Mediterranean world experienced one of the greatest systematic failures in history, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Cities are gone, borders dissolved, kings disappeared, trade non-existent. The old religious systems no longer worked and the gods were silent. In this vacuum, belief had to adapt to survive. And in this moment of historical instability, stories like the Israelite Exodus, for example, may not represent only sudden divine intervention, but a powerful example of how religion reshapes itself in a world without empires, a world in collapse. Welcome to Chasing the Past. Today we are talking about the Late Bronze Age collapse and the various cultural adaptations in its aftermath. What's good, everybody? I hope you're doing great today. This one was a fun research dive. It took me a little bit longer too, but a great book. I actually have it right here. It's just hanging out on my desk, but a great book. I've been reading this 1177 by, I'm pretty sure it's Dr. Eric H. Klein. And, I'm probably 150 pages into it, and it's just blowing my mind with the details in this collapse. The interconnected, they're more interconnected than you think they were. And I think Eric makes a great claim. By the way, love your book, Eric. After this one, then he does the After 1177, and that one is definitely on the list. But at least in terms of, I think understanding the Bronze Age collapse is important because of, generally, the Hebrew Bible or, the Homeric epics that you get from some of these stories. And one of them, we'll get to the topics there, but one of them is the connection he makes to scholarship understanding of Troy, and then how linguistically it worked into these civilizations, which is just awesome. Because not only is Troy a real place, but also if there's textual, evidence or archaeological evidence that you have of Troy, oh man, Brad Pitt would be so excited. But the thing that I keep getting in doing some of this stuff when it comes to at least an understanding of how history has worked in the past, it's that this also is the age where there's a huge power vacuum, and in that vacuum, the tools used are changing. The world has changed, so they now adapt to new places, new ideas, new thinkings, new text, right? All of this changes during this collapse. And so in order to understand that change in the world, I think this book and the information that we'll go through is super vital to understanding any of the historical parts of, let's say, Abrahamic faiths. At least for me personally, that's the reason that I started doing it anyways. But, a key point, we'll get to I kind of broke it down, but the things I want to mention are the causes, right? The catastrophes. So the bullet list, and holy cow. So you have earthquakes. We have evidence for earthquakes. So natural catastrophe, climate change, different climates now causing drought and famine. You have these internal rebellions of the stable, this stable Mediterranean world. They now have class wars inside of themselves. So destroy them from inside out, probably because of the drought, famine, the, I need water, we need water too. And it's eventually if you get hungry enough, you're going to fight from the inside out. And there were also these things, another episode would be fun, is the Sea Peoples. Because it's invasions documented in all of these different records of the Sea Peoples, and we have no idea who they are. We just don't. We have good guesses, but we don't know. And so all of this then creates this political instability where trade used to be, abundant. And then now these systems start to collapse and people kind of just scramble and they're trying to figure it out. And if, eventually everything comes crashing down and then society builds itself back up. There are a few that made it. There are a few that did okay. Dr. Eric Klein also has a PDF file and some documents I took pictures of with charts of who did the best, who did the worst. And so he also brings up something that I didn't know about, which is the disease, right? So he thinks maybe smallpox. And Ramses III, the mummy, there might be evidence there for rampant disease, especially in, cultures that then trade amongst one another, then now also spread disease to one another, which makes it even more difficult with all these things. And, I just think if someone is going into the depths like Eric is to do this research, I don't know. I just find it really fun. And if you're free anytime, I'd love to talk to you more about it. But some of the things that I wanted to mention is, these texts that are written, this post-collapse era text. So it's like the Homeric epics, the Hebrew Bible. These are all these adaptive responses to navigate this new and chaotic Iron Age that we all get into now. And so when I heard that, and I had to talk about it because there's a cool cultural adaptation of crafting a story, especially if you survive something so terrible in the world. Like, you probably feel pretty freaking privileged that you made it. And so there's a collapse of literacy and record keeping as well. So obviously it was a time of survival. This is day to day, right? You're eating yourself from the inside out. You probably aren't writing a whole lot. You had a world that was perfect, peaceful, trade was good. Yeah, maybe you had some wars with other people, but you had good relationships. And he has a good amount of letters too that he goes into where they talk to one another and they call themselves like brother, or they're not by family relation. They're not really brothers, but calling other kings like a valued name to establish there's a good connection there. And, in the minds of these people, like, they might have been living in this intermingled world more. So that means stories also are touching one another. They're sharing these things. And it always, when I was reading it, it reminded me of the Tower of Babel, where God's destruction of the world is connected to a unified single language speaking, essentially this time period, a world where everything is more connected than you think. They're unified. There is some conflict, but still unified. And that's not like up for debate. That's, at least in terms of Eric's work and most of the other people in the field, that's pretty accurate. And so with this being, let's just say, a modality of changing a story to fit the narrative because you're the one who survived, right? This destruction now comes down to, like, sin being the thing, right? Sin's the cause of this wrath. And then that's when you get, after this collapse, these Israelite Hebrew scriptures to justify this collapse. And then I thought it was funny that Babel itself was a play on the word, I guess the verb actually, to confuse. So again, think of the time period. It'd be so confusing that a world suddenly just collapses in on itself and you're just hanging out, trying to scramble around. Is there food, right? And, again, I know I keep saying this every time, but there's an episode now where I just figured out there may be some tie-ins to this, fall of man, sin from the beginning that really gets pushed by St. Augustine. Augustine, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, another good book is Adam, Eve, and the Serpent by Elaine Pagel. Fantastic. Has a great section on his idea, the Augustine, movement of the fall of man in like the 4th century. For like the idea, not the story. But anyway, in this case, particularly with this new sin being the cause, is like that's them justifying this collapse, right? So there is this unique religious adaptation that happens when really bad things happen to human beings. You have to move the story in a way to feel okay about it, right? And again, I completely resonate with that idea. Like, the only time that I'm able to sit here and read books and talk to you is because we're doing okay right now. Like it makes sense. And I've noticed there's a movement where more people are becoming, at least I guess maybe just in general, religious because of a feeling of instability right now. And so the fact that, we're not alone here, like the same thing happened way back then. It's like if the world collapsed right now, how would we come out of it? How would we understand it, I guess? And so that's a good note too here. But anyway, I liked bringing those two things to the forefront, that I didn't live there. I have no idea. But there are some really cool, at the end of this video, we'll get to the cool archaeological stuff and what they found. Because I had a lot of fun finding those out. And so, again, right, with the sin situation, I just wanted to bring up another Genesis quote, which is 3:22-24, where, people have totally just, Genesis has become either super rigid or you're like Sitchin's Anunnaki type deal. And so it does say, see, the humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now they might reach out their hands and take also from the tree of life, eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent them forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which they were taken. He drove out the humans. Right, I put emphasis on human beings. So like a period where there's more than just Adam and Eve in this story. And at the east, I don't know if this has any evidence, but I've never actually really looked at like the textual reading of this. But it says, the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life, which also is super reflective of other religious ideas, especially if like, we were going through some texts of, Sumerian and even Babylonian, where those same protective forces that sound kind of similar, right? The cherubim, the picture of a cherubim looks a lot like the scorpion people in Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think is cool, who also guard that. But Gilgamesh is let through because it's, 2/3 God, 1/3 human being. So he's allowed to go to this place. But I found that tie-in was kind of unique and represented maybe a culture that was sharing more than we thought. And maybe not only are the, exports, there are at least 3 that I know of that are wrecked ships around this time period that have literally one of the major players in this Mediterranean area. There is something from that culture on these boats. So it means there's a routine trading path that they're taking, and they're sharing not only, material goods, but they're sharing maybe intellectual goods, textual, readings of what they believe. Maybe you're sitting down somewhere, right? You're on the dock. You're like, I can't go out right now. You go into like a pub or something, and you guys start talking, and you're like, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I like that little piece there. Keep that in my mind. And so this idea of this interconnected, unified, it more advanced than we think they would be civilization existed. And then out of the blue, boom, it just collapses on itself. And, I'm not, this point of this video is not to, I would put it, discredit someone's belief system. It's very clear that they didn't care either. What I'm saying is there's a cool, adaptive response to, this collapse, right? So it might not be, let's say, a direct reflection of any of this time period, later text post collapse, but it is this, new rise in textual traditions that come out of this time period, which also, the argument is like religion could be a technology, right? An intellectual move towards a change in idea, or like to rebuild your identity, a cultural identity, to maybe a world that was centralized that isn't. So now you need to have this social cohesion almost in a world that doesn't have it anymore. So how do you do that? Well, then these texts themselves are pulling in that adaptive technology in this case. And one of the best ones, of course, would be then the Exodus story, right? Which does have this, reinterpretive reflection on Egypt's control over Canaan at one point during the Bronze Age, late in the Bronze Age. But instead, it becomes this idea of a divinely guided migration. So then, like, okay, so it's because, again, I didn't want to do that one. Exodus isn't the point. This is about adaptive religion, but also there's not a whole lot we can gather based on time period of a real Exodus story. And some people even make the case for Moses himself. But it's the idea is important. You are creating a new order for people, and then that new order is now a new contract, right? It's a new social contract of all of us with Yahweh, who gives us the identity we need. We don't have that. We need social organization. Okay, we can do a new base of operations here and kind of work up from there, which, it's very different than what was around at the time. So it's just this justification almost for, okay, there's a vacuum, power vacuum, right? Egypt collapsed, Canaanite collapse. The Hittite Empire was huge. They collapsed. We'll get into that too. And so the period that we're talking about is 1250 to 1150. That's why his book's 1177, kind of right in the middle there. Boom. Probably the closest to the collapse at the end. And so major cities were destroyed. Whole civilizations just here and then gone. Diplomatic and political, relationships, those are ruined, tarnished. No more trade, right? Writing systems, they just disappear. Early Greek, is it linear A or linear B? I really can't remember. But one of those we don't really know how to look at. So like writing systems themselves that were once prosperous and maybe, shared between people like, hey, what do you, like maybe you, this, me, you, my name, Chase, right? You see what I'm saying? Like you can kind of get this intermingling of maybe some type of linguistic shared stuff going on, but most of them just gone, vanished. We don't know. And this widespread devastation and then death is just something that's never been experienced before. So like something that these people have never had to like really go through now are having to try to justify what is going on, right? And I think that's a perfect way to segue into, an adaptive religious narrative for social cohesion. And so, when it runs its course in this Mediterranean, the, dark age, I guess if you want to call it, it's just dark, not in the sense of like evil stuff going down. It's just dark, like nothing's happening. Like, oh, it's just quiet, maybe a quiet time, but also not in these little pockets now that have pooled up. Anyway, so we already talked about most of this, but then we move into the Iron Age where that becomes the metal of choice. Before, again, Bronze Age means it was like copper and tin, and so you had to everyone had their own little resource, so you had to pool these things through, and, the quality of life was just not the same. And so for me, it's like imagining going to, this isn't, the scale of what I'm talking about with at least this collapse, but in my mind, the reference point is like, reminds me of the 1920s, that were really prosperous, and then boom, immediately you have just the Great Depression in the United States. So it's just prosperous to then nothing, right? And something I found interesting was the very little mention, at least maybe in my history classes, but, there's a really cool Egyptian, like, Hittite Empire rivalry. They're like top dogs. And they're the two most powerful kingdoms at the time in the late Bronze Age. So they had, how would I put this? I think I read somewhere it was like it's akin to the United States and the Soviet Union, like during the Cold War. You see if that makes sense? So, either in conflict with one another, even if it's, a proxy, right? Someone else to fight the war for them, constantly trying to like outflank each other and then work themselves out, diplomatically, but then also maybe militarily. And, most of the drama played out in this Eastern Mediterranean area. And so around Syria and Lebanon. Ironically, we're going to go through one of these places that has really cool evidence, at least archaeologically, for an early Israelite people being witnesses and being there to all of this, referencing the house of David. And so the earliest mention, I might add. But from his book, Eric had something called might mispronounce it, the Zananaza affair, which is with the, oh wow, what a name. Let's just keep it simple. It's with the Hittite king, referenced, it looks like Supailu Lima, the most successful Hittite king ever to rule. He received this weird letter from Queen, how do I put it? Queen Ankhsenamun, yeah. The queen's husband, right, famous Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut, died unexpectedly and left no heirs to succeed them. And so he asked this king to provide a son for her to marry, keep up political, diplomatic relations, promising that whoever he sends, one of his sons, will be a pharaoh of Egypt. And, because of the struggle that they've been going through militarily, diplomatically, he's suspicious. Because normally Egypt they don't marry off their females to just anybody, especially the foreigners. And so he ends up sending his son, I'm going to mess it up. He's the fourth eldest of 5 sons. Why can't I say that right now? Anyway, to marry the queen. Unfortunately, he would not become pharaoh because his party was ambushed en route somehow, and unknown group just killed him. And so clearly the Hittite king was furious and then believed it was all a plot to take him down. So he thinks he's been, betrayed. And so he starts attacking these Egyptian cities in Syria, starts capturing a number of these Egyptian soldiers. And unknown to them, a plague was spreading through Egypt, like we talked about earlier. So when they brought these soldiers back, they also brought back extreme plague. And it hit them hard. And so ultimately it took the life of this great family, this great Hittite king, and then took down the members of the royal family too. And the findings that I got from, let's say, a biblical narrative, they present a little bit of a different account of the Bronze Age. And so particularly the origins. So it pitches more of a military conquest of the Israelite people doing great things. But most of the stuff we get from the Levant is usually other people's victory steles, or other people's victories over these small, not super great fighting groups that are called, nomadic people. And so I just wanted to bring that up. There is a discrepancy there, at least between, someone with a biblical narrative and then findings in archaeological dig sites. And, remember, the Levant was a huge trade route. It was a huge hub for trade. And so Canaanite cities were big. The Phoenicians, I remember that from history class, they were huge. They controlled a lot of that little passageway between the Mediterranean. And so these extensive networks went throughout this area. And remember, they're trading, various people, various groups, various insights into what they believe, what they think, so changing culture. So not only are physical goods moving, but also significant cultural exchanges are happening at this time. And I just wanted to make sure we know the key players here, right? In the Levant, you have the Egyptian New Kingdom, right? Canaanites, Hittites, and then the Aramaeans. Cool? So the Egyptians, of course, they exerted the most influence over the Levant, right? The military outposts, controlling vital land, especially in the Sinai Peninsula, cities like Gaza, of course. And then the Canaanites, they're these indigenous people of the region, but they lived in independent city-states. And then each one of those are ruled by a king. Very similar to ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, right? Very, very similar. So they were these key players in this Mediterranean trade, right? Known for pottery, jewelry, different metalworkings. That you go to them. The Hittites, very interesting. They're a major player that are in modern-day Turkey. And the major power, they clash with Egypt, right? We just went over that, of course. But their influence also, remember, then extends into the Levant. And so, the Battle of Kadesh is a good one. I put that picture right here, but I think that was, 1270s, 1275, 4, something like that. And it's just really cool that not only I'll see if I can bring up the silver treaty too between the both of them, which was on a silver tablet. They carved into it. So they have the, the Semitic Akkadian script. And they have this tablet. They made it. I don't know if we have the silver treaty, but we have, I think, a reference to it at least, or a couple, where it's literally like in stone, but this one is pure silver. And I'm like, what the? Dude, I'm like, if that's somewhere, like, I haven't looked it up. I just read that this morning. Like, that's awesome. And, the Aramaeans are the semi-nomadic pastoralist people, kind of in like Syria, Mesopotamia, and they never like really formed this unified empire like the rest of them, but their language and culture spread, and they would gain dominance through this region after the collapse. So it kind of shows that even someone who is just really nomadic, maybe they're used to just work in the fields, can take root after this collapse. And Aramaeans are one of these groups. And to kind of round off, I knew it. We're about 30 minutes in. I knew that we would kind of get to some of these little, I just want to give you the big push and show you what a diverse world this was. And there were some places I found in the Levant that were really, really cool. So, for example, I found, again, forgive me, totally going to butcher these names. I think they seem kind of complex. Telerad, right, which is a early Bronze Age Canaanite city, which is found beneath an Iron Age level Judean fortress. So underneath the city that the early Judeans built on top of is the original city. And so underneath it, there's a huge, large fortified city, has residential homes, palace, a temple, and just this remarkable water system. And some of these things were like, oh, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. I've heard of that. So like, city of Dan, Tel Dan. I don't know why I said Tel Dan. But this site at Tel Dan was occupied from early Bronze Age through the Iron Age. But the historical significance, I remember we talked, it's right up by, it's called the Upper Galilean area, or Upper Galilee, which is close to Lebanon and Syria, which also we just read, right? Oh, interesting. Maybe a little bit of this, a little of that, right? Oh, who was up there? And so it's significant because it also is still in at least the textual evidence of the Hebrew Bible. So it looks like, I'm going to try to work it through. It looks like Laish, Laish, and then that's what it's known as. Then it becomes the sanctuary for the northern kingdom of Israel, where it becomes Lashem in Joshua. And so Laish was a peaceful Sidonian city in the northern Jordan Valley, captured and renamed Dan by the tribe of Dan, who made it their northmost settlement. Again, like I said, it's mentioned in Joshua, and was known for its prosperity and isolation. Also, you get references to like King Saul giving his daughter in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And so I went to look up why is this so important, and there's a good amount. So, for example, it's this weird spot that shouldn't be there, at least in prosperity, surrounding this other difficult terrain. So the melting snow from the Hermon Mountains provide the majority of the water of the Jordan River passes through Dan, and then it makes this immediately it makes this super fertile area, like just from this, and it has this lush vegetation, and so it seems like somewhat out of place because it's just an arid region where this city is prospering. So if I'm at this period of time where the world just collapsed on itself, we're gonna go visit Dan. And so it's also known for being isolated from the Assyrians at this time, and then I think it says Iran, yeah. They're by the Hermon Mountains, and so the Septuagint mentions the town was unable to have an alliance with the Arameans, right? We just talked about them, that other nomadic pastoral group. And so, ironically, the Masoretic text does not have Arameans at all, but states that the town had no relationship with any man. So I go, that's different. So it turns out textual scholars believe it's a scribal error. And so with Adham, which means men, being a mistake for Aram. So at this time, Dan suffered the expansion by the Arameans, and so that would be historically accurate rather than the textual mistake. And so it's the closest city to them in the kingdom of Israel at this time. So they would definitely go there and try to do what they can and take over. So in the book of Kings, there are several incursions here where Dan changes hands at least 4 times between the kingdom of Israel and these Arameans, right? So the time Israel was ruled by Ahab, and then the Armenians were ruled by, it looks like Ben-Hadad. I don't know why I just did it with the, doesn't matter. And then the successors from then. But they did find something that I had to bring up, and this is the cool thing at the end of the video, is this stele, the Tel Dan stele. And so it was created by the Arameans during one of these periods of time where they controlled Dan. Now, it's from the 9th century BCE, so they put it 870 to 750 BCE. And so it's a victory monument for the Aramean king, but it mentions it's confirming that King David as a historical figure because it mentions House of David. Now, the inscription is boasting of victories, including killing the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. So it means that, from what it says, is king, it looks like Jehoram of Israel and King Isa. I knew I would butcher it. I'll work on it, guys. But either way, this is still awesome. So the reference of House David here, it is widely accepted. And so the core evidence for this historical dynasty does stand, at least in that period of time. And so the Assyrians, remember, are to the south. And so Kingdom of Israel initially became this vassal state after rebelling, and then the Assyrians invaded. And then the town fell in 733, 732 BCE, right? And remember, you get later on this, you get the exilic period at this time in a couple hundred years where, a couple hundred, I'm pretty sure. And so keep that in mind too as you're walking through this kind of it's almost like a puzzle, which I think is why I like it so much. That you're putting a puzzle of history together. And So from these excavations, right, it reveals this cultic area in Dan where it's this religious compound. And I I don't know what this means. Maybe I'll look it up later in a research thing. But the altar has a center altar with large four horns. And it has, all I got was a diverse amount of cult paraphernalia. And they seem to be in line with the biblical account, which portrays Dan as a major cultic center of the kingdom of Israel from the reign of Jeroboam. And so it says it's 1 Kings. So I don't know what that means. If someone else does, comment down below. And then you have another one like Tel Hazor is a good one, another major Canaanite city that was later taken over by the Israelites and habitated there. And Tel Gazir has a lot of controversy behind it, but I wanted to end with it because some of it is just, has been kind of become nonsense, it sounds like. So I wanted to get it right. So it is a major Canaanite city-state, I should say. And so where it's situated strategically, right? Again, the mentions in Joshua and Solomon in the Hebrew Bible, but it is a vital trade route between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Jerusalem. And remember, they're sharing stuff, not just material, cultural stuff. A lot of things we go through in Egypt and Mesopotamia also come from these early textual Hebrew books. And in this Canaanite era, it's a well-fortified city, right? A big predominant gate, deep underground water systems, and massive walls. So it's not just like a little tiny podunk place. And so the religious significance, it says there's a large ritual area with 10 standing stones and a carved stone basin, said possibly for uniting city-states or practicing religious rites. Now, the Bible mentions Gazir as a powerful Canaanite city that resisted Israelites but was eventually captured by Pharaoh, then given to Solomon and rebuilt by him. So again, remember there's a little bit of change. You're wanting to change a narrative for social cohesion, but there's a little bit of truth in those as well. And, these excavations that they did at Tel Gazir, they uncovered, new things about Canaanite culture, offerings to gods of, gold and silver, ritual jars, is what it said, which kind of threw me for a loop, but we'll fix that. And then boundary stones, because these ritual jars now become something with child sacrifice. But the thing I found is that was an idea from Robert McAllister's excavation between 1902 to 1909. So there are fair warning here, a little graphic, but there are infant inhumations in jars, some of which have been burned. And so these associations are with the quote-unquote high place. And then the idea, he said, was, oh my God, these are sacrificial remains of children. But I think that's kind of been like, I don't think so. Because, it's not, the infant burials are older than this ritualistic place. And so it just shows kind of maybe there's an interplay where they weren't used at the same time. So the simplest argument that I found, and, quote unquote, most widely accepted, would be that it was just, an infant cemetery. And maybe cremation is the one that says, but also some of these bodies were cremated, which also, if you go to, we read the Iliad, we read some of this, making sure, at least in Mycenae and some of these Greek cultures, you needed that body and you needed to cremate it, or else it's not going to go well for them in the afterlife. They're not going to have one. And I just wanted to make that clear. But at least the idea of these rapid culture shifting and moving and changing the way that this world that was once stable, that is now, brimmed to the top full with instability, how do we bring that in? Boom. This is when we get a prime time example of the world creating narratives, religious narratives, as, a way to cohesively use it in society. And the thing that, to close out and I don't want to take away anything else, but the collapse of the late Bronze Age shows us that, how do I put this? It emerges in a response to instability. And so when empires fall, beliefs become portable, you take them everywhere you go, authority collapses, identity then becomes like the key part, because the world is now coming down. Who are we, right? What do we want to say? That's a cultural shift and you have to have that discussion with you and the people. So I'm not saying that, oh, it's so wrong, you shouldn't believe or whatever. To them, it wasn't. Most of these people, it wasn't. This is how we maintain what we have right now. We need to survive. We need to come back. And so, yes, maybe the stories like the Exodus don't necessarily tell us about a true story of divinity, but it's about a people who survived a world that no longer made sense, and they had to craft something for it to survive, to make it. And so that's why these narratives are important, and why going through these is really important, for me at least, to understand. I'm just trying to understand the people, the time, the place. I'm going to get a t-shirt. I swear to God, I'm going to get a t-shirt. And it's just going to say, let's get in our time machine, and I'll wear it for the shoot. Because that's what I was about to say. I want to get in the time machine, and I want to go back and feel like what it was during the Bronze Age collapse. And how would I react to it, right? I'm not putting a belief system in my head. I'm trying to understand theirs. And I think we need to do that more often in society. And so even today's climate of uncertainty, we still turn to story, which I find ironic because I'm doing that too now. But those stories then have meaning, and then that belief, right? It drives something in us. And the idea is to make sure that we're strong enough to endure whatever hardship lies in front of us. And that's why I think stories are important to like the human condition in general. But anyway, that's all I had. I'm brimful of joy right now after going through all that, because now I just want to keep reading Eric's book. So I'm going to do that. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And keep seeking. Let's get in our time machine. Okay, bye guys.